the period from the rise of the first cities and writing to the present day is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, the main occupation of our species, Homo sapiens, was hunting. It's important to understand that the largest biomass of animals is found in open landscapes like steppes, savannas, and tundras, vast areas with few trees. Forests, on the other hand, produce a lot of plant biomass, but most animals can't access it as food. The ancestors of modern domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, goats, and horses lived in steppes and foothills. Even the term herbivores makes it clear. They need grass, which steppes provide in abundance. Even extinct giants like mammoths roamed the tundra steppe. And until recently, massive elephant populations thrived in African savannas. Ancient humans depended on hunting and seasonal migrations, following the herds. The most common Stone Age archaeological sites are called camps, indicating temporary settlements. But then, around 12,000 years ago, the interglacial period began. Warmer, wetter conditions allowed forests to spread across vast areas, shrinking the habitat of herd animals and triggering a hunting crisis. Many think farming and animal husbandry were revolutionary discoveries. Like one day, someone just figured out that keeping animal offspring in pens or planting seeds would make life much easier. But in reality, groups living in regions where hunting was still viable weren't eager to switch to farming. In other words, people often turned to agriculture out of necessity rather than choice. As historian Kirill Resnick points out, the average male height in the Upper Paleolithic was 170 cm, but in the Neolithic, it dropped to 161 cm and only started rising again in the Bronze Age. As an archaeologist friend of mine used to say, the Neolithic period put humans on their knees, literally. But despite declining height, populations grew. Some might ask whether farming or herding came first, but in reality, economies were usually mixed. Farming byproducts and nearby lands supported a limited number of domestic animals. However, in the Neolithic, the Middle East periodically faced droughts which wild plants could handle relatively well, but domesticated crops couldn't survive. Frequent droughts, dry winds, and soil erosion made farming difficult in Eurasian and Middle Eastern steppes. The solution? Herding and moving between pastures. You might think this is when nomads appeared, but not yet. True nomadic culture required two more things: the domestication of the horse and the invention of the wheel. The development of an economy where animal husbandry played a central role and seasonal migrations from pasture to pasture occurred during the Bronze Age. However, such tribes are not called true nomads, but rather mobile pastoralists. This system proved so effective that Indo-European herders spread across much of Europe and even into India. As they expanded, many agricultural cultures like the mysterious Trypillians vanished. By the first millennium BCE, nomadic expansions from the east became routine. One of the first full-fledged nomadic groups, the Cimmerians, helped introduce ironworking across much of Europe. Nomads had been metalworkers since ancient times. Building a bloomery furnace, the type used in Europe well into the late Middle Ages, took just half an hour with sticks and clay. Ore was often found on the surface, with little need for mining. So when Robert E. Howard wrote about Conan the Barbarian's Cimmerians as early masters of steel, he wasn't far from the truth. Cimmerians are mentioned in Greek and Assyrian sources, but in the 7th century BCE, a new wave of nomads arrived from the east, the Scythians. They spread from the Altai Mountains to the Carpathians and were well known to the Greeks. At times, cities in the Black Sea region, Asia Minor, and the Near East paid tribute to them. The Scythians even defeated the Persian king Darius without direct battle, simply by surrounding his army and raining arrows down on them. By the 4th century BCE, a new wave of steppe nomads, the Sarmatians, displaced the Scythians. Unlike their predecessors, they had full-fledged heavy cavalry. For perspective, in the 3rd century BCE, Japan was still in the Jomon period, essentially the Stone Age, with no knowledge of metal. Meanwhile, the Sarmatians invaded the Danube region and became a major headache for Rome. However, the Romans found a diplomatic approach to the Sarmatian nobility. As a result, nomads became Rome's allies, and 5,000 Sarmatian cavalrymen even served in Britain. Some see their armored cavalry as a prototype for European knights and the legends of King Arthur. It's also worth noting that terms like Scythians, Sarmatians, and later Tatars didn't always refer to a single culture, but rather a collective of nomadic tribes that sometimes acted together despite cultural differences. The Sarmatians from the vast Asian steppes were eventually replaced by the nomadic Huns, whose leader Attila built an empire stretching from the Volga and the Caucasus to the Rhine. To achieve this, he had to push out the Germanic tribes, which in turn moved towards Rome. However, in the 6th century, a new wave of nomads, the Avars, arrived and settled along the Danube. According to Hungarian archaeologists and anthropologists, the Avars were mostly Caucasian, but their ruling elite had Mongoloid features. By the 7th century, though, a Slavic uprising and a defeat by the Byzantines pushed them to the fringes of history. Around the same time, the Bulgars arrived on the Danube, contributing to the formation of both modern Bulgarians and Tatars. Then came the well-known Cumans, who, during the Kievan Rus' era, controlled the eastern and southern parts of what is now Ukraine, extending all the way to Hungary and Bulgaria. And then, in the 13th century, came the Mongol invasion, which, according to some alternative researchers, never happened. And if it did, the Mongols apparently didn't know metalworking or long-distance travel. A bit later, in the mid-15th century, warriors from the Turkmen steppes took Constantinople, putting an end to the last remnant of the Roman Empire, Byzantium. As you can see, I've just given a brief overview of the waves of nomads that poured into Europe. In China, too, nearly every other dynasty was founded by nomads. Even the modern currency, the yuan, is named after one such dynasty, established by Genghis Khan's grandson. As for the Great Wall of China, it never really stopped any serious invasion. Instead, it mostly prevented farmers who weren't exactly thrilled about their privilege to toil for the local nobility from escaping to the freedom of the steppe. Eastern Europe didn't have a wall, but it did have open steppes. As a result, those who weren't too keen on working for landowners became outlaws, eventually forming the Cossacks. These warriors borrowed heavily from nomadic traditions and even had their own nomadic elements. Looking at Eurasian history from antiquity to the Middle Ages, it becomes clear that nomads' main enemies weren't always farmers. More often, they fought other nomads. Nomads controlled vast steppe and forest steppe regions. But what was the secret to their success? In reality, it was pretty simple. Their entire way of life was built around a highly efficient economy. And no, nomads weren't just herders. Sometimes they practiced a bit of farming, and occasionally they even settled down permanently. But if we focus on livestock, here's what we need to understand. For example, a single sheep, depending on its age, season, and food availability, gains between 500 and 1,000 grams per month, with an average of about 750 grams. A flock of 1,000 sheep gains about 750 kilograms per month. Every 7 to 8 months, a sheep gives birth to multiple lambs, which, in ideal conditions, can nearly double the flock. But here's the key part. A single herder, or maybe two, can manage a flock of 1,000, and even teenagers can handle the job. Even more importantly, as the herd grows, the number of herders doesn't have to increase proportionally. A handful of herders can manage thousands of animals. By contrast, farming labor was entirely dependent on manpower. In fact, up until the modern era, and even into recent history in some places, about 90% of the population were peasants. This type of economy led to stark social divisions. The feudal elite, fearing uprisings and wanting to tighten their grip, made sure peasants were kept away from military affairs. In Kievan Rus', for example, the prince's druzhina, warrior retinue, quickly became hereditary, turning into an equivalent of Western European knights. At the same time, these retinues often numbered just a few hundred warriors per prince, leading to a paradox. Even though farming societies supported much larger populations than herding ones, about 90% of that population was tied to agricultural labor. On top of that, medieval Europe was a patchwork of small villages where most peasants lived. This made them easy targets for raids and made large-scale defense or mobilization difficult. There were no centralized states in the modern sense, just a collection of principalities, each dependent on another to some degree. And strangely enough, nomads were both fewer and greater in number, meaning their overall population was smaller, but the percentage of men free from daily labor was much higher than among farmers. Plus, herding required defending livestock from predators, so pretty much everyone knew how to use a bow. At the same time, while farmers often lacked enough horses for plowing, nomads, being livestock breeders, were all mounted and ready to ride. Unlike a peasant, a nomad didn't need to be armed. He lived with weapons in hand and was trained as a mounted warrior from childhood. All he needed to go on a campaign was a leader to unite the tribes, and when that happened, up to 90% of the men could join the fight. And this didn't cripple their economy. Their herds continued to graze as usual. Meanwhile, in medieval agricultural states, nomads were usually met by a small, well-equipped feudal elite that made up only a tiny percentage of the population. In the end, nomads could create a numerical advantage even when invading densely populated regions. Because, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter how many people live in a country. What matters is how many well-equipped warriors you can gather at the right place and time. And nomads weren't just some chaotic horde. They had strict discipline and well-coordinated military units. However, history shows that whenever nomads tried to take over settled societies and integrate into their ruling structures, they were either wiped out or assimilated. That's why, rather than taking over bureaucratic structures, they usually just forced rulers to pay tribute and left governance to the locals. From the first millennium BC up until the late Middle Ages, nomads were the ultimate force to be reckoned with. But then history hit them with a balance patch. Europe started leveling up, kings started optimizing their kingdoms, and feudal chaos turned into actual governments, fewer states, but larger realms. Feudal knights became relics, replaced by armies of trained soldiers. Swords and arrows faded into history, outmatched by the roar of gunpowder. Sedentary societies had way more room for progress, and when the modern era rolled in, nomads just couldn't keep up. In the end, most of their lands ended up in the hands of good old-fashioned farmers,